The airfield at Saratov was not built for ceremony. In the early autumn of 1942, it was a strip of compacted earth, a collection of wooden huts, and a perimeter of birch trees already beginning to drop their leaves in the cold. A flatbed rail car had arrived the previous evening, and on it sat something the Soviet mechanics had never seen up close. Stenciled crates, American markings. Inside them, when the crowbars finally did their work, were wings, fuselages, and tail sections of fighter the Americans called the P-39 Airacobra. The senior technical officer on the field that morning was a man who had spent 3 years maintaining Polikarpov I-16s and the occasional Lag-3. He walked around the crated components the way a man walks around an animal he cannot quite identify. He noted the tricycle landing gear, a feature so unusual by Soviet standards that several junior mechanics assumed an assembly error had been made. He noted the car-type door on the fuselage side, hinged like something from a civilian automobile. He noted the engine placement, not up from behind the propeller, where any reasonable person would put it, but in the middle of the fuselage, directly behind the pilot's seat, connected to propeller shaft by a long extension running beneath the cockpit floor. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he went to find the senior pilot. That pilot's name was Alexander Pokrishkin. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Pokrishkin was 29 years old in the autumn of 1942. He had already been decorated twice, had already seen close friends killed in the first catastrophic months of the German invasion, and had already formed opinions about Soviet aircraft that were frank to the point of being dangerous. He had flown the MiG-3, which was fast at altitude and nearly uncontrollable near the ground. He had flown the Lag-3, which Soviet pilots had nicknamed the Lakarovny Garantirovny Grob, the varnish guaranteed coffin, a reference both to its lacquered plywood construction and its habit of killing its own crews. He had survived those machines through a combination of skill, caution, and a methodical habit of mind that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. When Pokrishkin walked out to see the Airacobra that morning, he was prepared to dislike it. Most Soviet pilots were. The P-39's reputation had arrived before the aircraft itself, and had not arrived in flattering form. To understand what those pilots believed they were receiving, it is necessary to go back roughly 2 years and 3,000 miles to the United States Army Air Corps and the political history of a fighter that never quite fit the war it was sent to fight. The Bell Aircraft Corporation of Buffalo, New York, had designed the P-39 in the late 1930s around a concept that was, on paper, genuinely innovative. The Allison V-1710 liquid-cooled engine would be mounted amidships, behind the pilot, driving propeller through an extension shaft. This arrangement would free the nose for a 37mm cannon, firing directly through propeller hub, a weapon of considerably greater destructive power than the rifle-caliber machine guns most contemporary fighters carried. The center of gravity positioning, Bell's engineers argued, would give the aircraft excellent maneuverability. The tricycle undercarriage, then radical in military aircraft, would make ground handling safer and more predictable. When the XP-39 prototype flew in April 1939, it showed genuine promise. At altitude, it was fast, reaching speeds near 390 miles per hour during initial trials, numbers that attracted serious attention. The Army Air Corps ordered it into production. Then came the modifications. Military procurement committees added armor plating, heavier armament, and self-sealing fuel tanks. Each addition was sensible in isolation. Each one added weight. The supercharger, a General Electric unit that had given the prototype its high-altitude performance, was removed in the production version, a decision made partly on weight grounds and partly because the Army believed the P-39 would operate primarily at low and medium altitudes. The cumulative result of these changes was an aircraft that was noticeably slower, noticeably heavier, and noticeably less capable above 15,000 feet than the prototype figures had suggested. By the time the P-39D began reaching American and British units in 1941, pilots were already discovering the gap between expectation and reality. The British received a batch under lend-lease and almost immediately returned the majority of them. Royal Air Force pilots found the aircraft inferior to the Spitfire and the Hurricane at the altitudes where they were expected to fight German bombers and their escorts. The Airacobra, the RAF concluded, was not what they needed over southern England. The Americans used it in the Pacific in the first chaotic months after Pearl Harbor and found similar limitations when it met Japanese Zeros at medium and high altitudes, where Japanese pilots held clear advantages in climb and maneuverability. None of this was entirely the aircraft's fault. The P-39 was being asked to do what it had not been designed to do: high-altitude interception against fast, agile opposition with good climbing performance. At low and medium altitude, the picture was considerably different, but the early impression stuck. When the Soviet Union began receiving P-39s through the lend-lease program in 1942, the aircraft's reputation arrived with it. Soviet airmen had access to foreign press, to the opinions of liaison officers, to fragments of information that filtered back from British and American experiences. What they had heard was consistent. The Airacobra was a flawed machine, outclassed by its German opponents, rejected by the British, and considered second-rate even by the Americans who sent it. Some pilots referred to it openly as a reject, a second-hand article passed along because the Americans had no further use for it. This perception was unfair in ways that would soon become apparent, but it was widespread and sincere, and it colored the first encounters Soviet pilots had with the machine. The logistics of receiving lend-lease aircraft in the Soviet Union in 1942 were themselves a lesson in industrial complexity. Aircraft came primarily via two routes. The first was the southern route through Iran, where American aircraft were flown from the Persian Gulf region northward to Soviet territory. The second, and ultimately more significant for the Airacobra, was the Alaska-Siberia ferry route, known by its Russian acronym ALSIB, across which American aircraft were flown by Soviet ferry pilots from Fairbanks, Alaska, eastward across Siberia to airfields deep inside the Soviet Union. This route, established formally in September 1942, would eventually carry nearly 8,000 aircraft of various types to Soviet forces. The P-39 would account for a substantial portion of them. At the receiving end of these routes, Soviet technical personnel had to learn to maintain an aircraft they had never previously worked with, using manuals translated from English with varying degrees of accuracy, parts applied to a chain that stretched across 2 continents and 2 oceans, and technical support from American instructors who were often hampered by language barriers and the general chaos of wartime. The Allison V-1710 engine was particularly demanding. It required higher octane fuel than Soviet ground crews were accustomed to handling. Its cooling system was intricate, and overheating became a persistent problem in the first months of Soviet operation, often the result of maintenance procedures that worked perfectly well on Soviet engines but were incorrect for the Allison's tighter tolerances. Spark plug fouling was common. Oil consumption surprised crews used to different standards. There was a period in late 1942 when availability rates for Soviet P-39s were substantially below what American technical advisors considered acceptable, and the aircraft mechanical reputation suffered accordingly. Against this background, the psychological resistance of Soviet pilots is understandable. They were being asked to trust their lives to a machine that seemed to have been designed by committee, rejected by allies, and maintained through improvisation. The car-type door, which would later be cited by many pilots as a genuine advantage in bailout situations because it allowed the pilot to exit more quickly than a sliding canopy required, was initially regarded with suspicion. Nothing about a fighter aircraft should resemble a Packard. The mid-mounted engine made the aircraft's balance feel unfamiliar in early handling, and pilots accustomed to the immediate, nose-heavy responsiveness of Soviet types found the Airacobra's handling characteristics initially disorienting. Several of the first pilots to fly the type in Soviet service came away with impressions that were, at best, cautiously neutral. At worst, they were openly negative. There are accounts from the period of pilots who requested reassignment rather than fly the American machine, though such requests were rarely granted in the desperate conditions of 1942, when the Wehrmacht was deep inside Soviet territory and the Red Air Force was losing aircraft and pilots faster than it could replace either. The Battle of Stalingrad, which reached its crisis in the winter of 1942 and 43, placed Soviet aviation under extraordinary pressure. German Luftwaffe, the air fleet supporting Army Group South, was well-equipped and experienced. Its fighter units flew Messerschmitt Bf-109F and Bf-109G variants, aircraft that had accumulated 2 years of combat refinement and were flown by pilots whose training standards remained high, even as German manpower began to strain under the accumulated losses of the war's first years. Soviet units absorbing lend-lease aircraft had no time for the gradual adjustment that might have allowed pilots to discover the P-39's genuine qualities at their own pace. They were thrown into combat. What happened in those first months of combat was not what anyone had predicted. The pilots who began to achieve results in the P-39 were not, at first, the famous names. They were junior officers flying the chaos over the Caucasus and along the Don in conditions that happened, almost accidentally, to suit the aircraft in ways that high-altitude combat over Britain never had. The fighting over the southern Soviet Union in the winter of 1942 and 43 was predominantly low-altitude work. German ground attack aircraft, Heinkel He-111 bombers, Junkers Ju-87 Stuka bombers, and Ju-88s operated at heights between 3,000 and 12,000 feet, the band where the Airacobra's Allison engine, without its high-altitude supercharger, was in its element. German fighter cover often descended to meet Soviet interceptors at similar altitudes, bringing the Bf-109 into a height range where its own advantages were less decisive than they were at 20,000 feet. In this environment, the P-39's characteristics began to look different. The 37mm cannon in the nose, which had seemed like an interesting theoretical novelty to American and British pilots who never fully exploited it, turned out to be devastatingly effective against the lightly armored German aircraft that Soviet pilots were meeting. A single hit from the M4 cannon could destroy a bomber. 2 hits were rarely necessary. Against the Bf-109, the cannon required precision because the lower rate of fire demanded that each shell find its target. But pilots who could hold their aim long enough to fire found the results conclusive in a way that rifle-caliber machine guns simply could not match. The aircraft's low-altitude speed, its roll rate, and above all its dive characteristics also began to earn respect. At 12,000 feet and below, the P-39 could hold its own against the Bf-109G in horizontal turns. It could outdive many opponents. Its radio equipment, American-made and considerably more reliable than much of what Soviet pilots had been issued, allowed formations to communicate with clarity that transformed tactical coordination. Soviet pilots had fought for years in conditions where radio unreliability meant that visual signals and pre-planned formations were the primary tools of air combat. To be able to hear, and more importantly to be heard, changed the nature of tactical thinking. It was into this emerging and still contested reappraisal that Alexander Pokrishkin brought a particular method of mind. Pokrishkin was not a natural, in the sense of a pilot who thrived on instinct and improvisation. He was something rarer, a pilot who thought systematically about why things worked and why they did not. He kept notebooks. He analyzed his own engagements and the engagement of others with the same deliberate attention that a chess analyst brings to reviewing games. He had concluded, well before the Airacobra arrived, that Soviet air combat doctrine was flawed, that the tight formations and defensive tactics dictated by pre-war regulations were getting pilots killed in ways that tactical aggressiveness could prevent. The P-39 gave him an instrument that, if he was right about what low-altitude fighting required, could validate his theories. What he found when he finally flew would force him to revise almost everything he believed about the aircraft, and several things he believed about himself. Pokrishkin's first solo flight in the P-39 lasted 34 minutes. By his own account, recorded in his post-war memoir Nebo Vojny, or Sky of War, he spent the first 10 of those minutes simply flying straight and level, feeling the aircraft rather than testing it, the way an experienced horseman will walk a new animal before asking anything of it. What he noticed first was not speed or maneuverability. It was stability. The Airacobra, with its mid-mounted engine placing the center of gravity close to the aircraft's geometric center, was unusually steady in level flight. For a pilot who had spent years fighting the MiG-3's tendency to snap into uncontrolled rolls at low speed and the Lag-3's sluggish, waterlogged responses, the P-39 felt, in his words, like a platform. That word, platform, would recur in Soviet pilot testimony about the Airacobra more than almost any other. It referred not to comfort, but to the aircraft quality as a gun platform, its capacity to hold a precise aim while the pilot tracked a target through a turn or a dive. The Airacobra's weight and its center of gravity placement, both of which had contributed to American and British criticism of the aircraft, produced a steadiness in the gun sight picture that Soviet aces found valuable beyond almost any other quality. Pokrishkin wrote that he could hold the German in his sight for a full 2 to 3 seconds at the end of a turning engagement, time enough to make the 37mm cannon decisive. In the Soviet fighters he had flown before, that kind of sustained aim was nearly impossible. The second thing he noticed on that first flight, and on the several that followed, was the dive. The P-39 dived with a confidence that surprised him. Its airframe, heavier than Soviet contemporaries, carried speed in a dive and held it through recovery in a way that opened tactical possibilities he had not previously had. A Bf-109 pilot who believed he was safe by diving away from a Soviet fighter had, in Pokrishkin's experience with the MiG-3, usually been correct. The MiG bled speed in a dive and could not sustain the pursuit. The Airacobra could. This single characteristic, which no amount of reading American technical assessments had conveyed to him, altered his calculation of what an engagement with Bf-109 could look like from beginning to end. He spent several weeks working through the aircraft's limits with a methodical patience that defined him. He tested it at low speed near stall, finding the handling honest and predictable, without the vicious snap that had killed numerous Soviet pilots in types with less forgiving stall characteristics. He tested the cannon, learning the rhythm of its lower rate of fire, adjusting his approach to target, so that he closed the ranges where a single shell's accuracy could be trusted. He tested the radio, which worked. He tested the car-type door and emergency egress drills, and agreed with the American designer's reasoning. In a bailout situation, particularly at low altitude where seconds were the difference between a parachute opening and an impact with the ground, the hinge door was faster than fighting a sliding canopy that might be jammed by structural damage. By the spring of 1943, Pokrishkin had not merely accepted the Airacobra, he had built a tactical system around it. The system is worth describing in some detail, because it became one of the most influential contributions to Soviet air combat doctrine of the entire war, and because the P-39's specific characteristics were not incidental to it, but foundational. Pokrishkin called his approach Vysota, Skorost, maneuver, Ogon, altitude, speed, maneuver, fire. The sequence was deliberate. Altitude came first because it was a prerequisite for everything else. A pilot who held altitude above his opponent held the initiative. Speed came second because it was altitude converted into kinetic energy, the currency of attack. Maneuver came third, not as an end in itself, the endless turning circles of outdated dogfight thinking, but as the means of achieving a firing solution. Fire came last, and it came from close range, from a stable platform, with a 37mm cannon pointed at a target the pilot had already dominated through the first 3 elements of sequence. This formula was not invented from nothing. Pokrishkin had been thinking about air combat in these terms for some time, but the P-39 was the first aircraft he had flown that could actually execute all 4 elements of the sequence as he conceived them. Its low-altitude speed gave him the energy advantage. Its dive capability preserved that advantage when an opponent tried to disengage. Its stability gave him the gun platform the final element required. The cannon gave the final element finality. Flying a MiG-3 or a LAG-3, his formula had been theoretically correct, but practically incomplete. Flying the Airacobra, all 4 elements became executable in the same engagement. The Kuban campaign of the spring and summer of 1943 was a crucible in which Pokrishkin's system met its test. The Kuban region, a strip of territory between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov in the North Caucasus, became the site of the largest and most sustained air battles on the Eastern Front to that point. Both sides understood the strategic stakes. Germany needed the airspace to cover its Kuban bridgehead and supply its forces in Crimea. The Soviet Union needed to establish air superiority as a prerequisite for the eventual recapture of the peninsula. The Luftwaffe committed experienced units, including Jageschwader 52, whose roster by that time included some of the highest-scoring fighter pilots in aviation history. Pokrishkin flew into that campaign with the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, equipped with P-39s. What he accomplished between April and June of 1943 shattered the accumulated skepticism about both the aircraft and the doctrine he had built around it. He claimed 22 aerial victories in that period, a figure that made him the leading Soviet ace of the Kuban battles. More significant than the number was a pattern. Almost every engagement followed the template he had developed. Altitude advantage established before the attack. Dive to build speed. A single pass at close range with the cannon. Disengagement back to altitude before the opponent could react. The Airacobra's dive performance made the disengagement reliable in a way it had never been in his previous aircraft. He was not getting into extended turning fights and surviving through superior skill, which was the old way of flying, in a way that exhausted and eventually killed even excellent pilots. He was imposing the terms of each engagement from the beginning and refusing to fight on any other terms. His fellow pilots in the regiment watched and adapted. The learning was not abstract. Pokrishkin was teaching actively, holding discussions after missions, drawing diagrams in the dirt, insisting that his wingmen and the younger pilots understand not just what to do, but why the physics of each maneuver produced its result. Soviet air combat culture had not traditionally emphasized this kind of systematic instruction. The pre-war Air Force had trained pilots to follow orders and formations, not to think independently about tactical geometry. Pokrishkin's insistence on intellectual engagement with the problem of air combat was itself a departure, and it was enabled partly by the Airacobra's reliability and radio capability, which made coordination possible in ways that previous Soviet equipment had not reliably allowed. Other pilots were reaching their own conclusions about the aircraft through different paths. Grigory Rechkalov, who would end the war as the second highest scoring Soviet ace with 56 confirmed victories, flew P-39s throughout much of his most productive period. Rechkalov was a different temperament from Pokrishkin. Less systematic, more instinctive, a pilot who flew by feel rather than formula. His relationship with the Airacobra was also different. He valued the cannon with something close to affection, describing in later interviews the satisfaction of a 37mm hit, the way a German aircraft would simply come apart rather than trailing smoke and limping away as it sometimes did after rifle-caliber hits. He was less interested than Pokrishkin in the aircraft's platform stability and more interested in its roll rate, which at low altitude gave him the ability to reverse directions quickly in close-quarters maneuvering without the energy penalty that heavier aircraft suffered. Rechkalov's testimony about the P-39 was not theoretical. It was visceral. He did not think of it as an American machine or a lend-lease compromise. He thought of it as his aircraft, the one that fit his hands. Nikolai Giliev, who accumulated 57 confirmed victories and was known for an attacking aggressiveness that bordered on recklessness, flew P-39s in the period of his greatest operational success. Giliev's approach to the Airacobra was characteristically direct. He liked it because it killed Germans efficiently. He was less interested in technical analysis and more interested in the result. But the result he achieved with the P-39 was consistent enough to constitute its own form of endorsement. Giliev was known to close the ranges that other pilots considered suicidally short before firing, and at those ranges the 37mm cannon's performance was, in his judgment, worth the risk of the approach. The aircraft's stability in the final seconds before firing was what made that approach viable. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Not every Soviet ace agreed. It is important to acknowledge the dissent, because the picture of universal Soviet enthusiasm for the P-39 that sometimes appears in post-war accounts is a simplification. Ivan Kozadub, who became the highest-scoring Allied ace of the war with 64 confirmed victories, flew the P-39 briefly and found it unsatisfying. He preferred the La-5 and later the La-7, Soviet-designed fighters that he felt gave him more control over the engagement at the altitudes and in the tactical situations where he most often fought. Kozadub's victories were accumulated primarily in a different operational context from Pokrishkin's, with more emphasis on medium-altitude combat and bomber interception, a profile that suited the La-5's supercharged engine better than it suited the Allison. His reservation about the P-39 was not that it was a bad aircraft, but that it was not his aircraft, not matched to his particular fighting style and operational environment. The maintenance question also resolved itself, though not quickly and not without cost. As Soviet technical personnel accumulated experience with the Allison engine, reliability improved substantially. American instructors stationed at lend-lease receiving depots worked with Soviet ground crews to establish correct procedures for the engine's particular demands, and by 1943 the availability rates for Soviet P-39s had improved to levels that allowed sustained operational use. The fuel supply issue was addressed through the same lend-lease channels that brought the aircraft. High-octane aviation fuel became a significant component of American supply shipments, and Soviet airfields operating P-39 units were prioritized for its delivery. By the summer of 1943, the aircraft that Soviet pilots had initially received with suspicion and resentment had become, in certain units and under certain commanders, the preferred mount. Pokrishkin refused to transition to newer Soviet types when they became available, continuing to fly the Airacobra through his most productive period of the war. This was not sentiment. It was a judgment of a pilot who had thought carefully about what he needed and had concluded that the P-39, flown according to his doctrine and in the operational conditions of the Southern Eastern Front, gave him more what he needed than the alternatives. He flew it to his third hero of the Soviet Union decoration, the first Soviet pilot to receive that honor 3 times, an achievement made in an aircraft that his colleagues had initially dismissed as a rejected second-hand machine from an ally who did not want it. The numbers that accumulated in Soviet P-39 units through 1943 and into 1944 constituted a statistical argument that was difficult to dismiss. The 9th Guards Fighter Aviation Division, which Pokrishkin eventually commanded, and which was almost entirely equipped with Airacobras, became the highest-scoring fighter division in the Soviet Air Force. Its cumulative aerial victory claims ran into the hundreds, achieved a loss rate that compared favorably with Soviet units flying domestic aircraft. These were not the numbers of pilots making do. They were the numbers of pilots who had found, in an aircraft initially considered second-rate, a combination of qualities that matched their requirements precisely. Pokrishkin's own final tally of 59 confirmed aerial victories, achieved predominantly in the P-39, placed him second only to Kozadub among Soviet aces. The irony was not lost on those who watched Soviet pilots walk around those first crated Airacobras with expressions of poorly concealed disappointment. The aircraft that pilots had called a reject, a machine passed along, because its original recipients had no further use for it, had become the mount of the Soviet Union's most celebrated fighter pilot, in the hands of which he had developed a doctrine that would define Soviet air combat, thinking for the remainder of the war. The war moved north and west as the months accumulated. By the summer of 1944, Soviet forces had recaptured the Kuban, broken the siege of Leningrad, and were pressing into Ukraine and Belorussia along a front that stretched nearly 2,000 miles. The air war changed character as it moved. German resistance was still lethal, still technically capable in the hands of experienced Luftwaffe pilots, but the weight of numbers had shifted irrevocably. Soviet industrial production, combined with a steady flow of lend-lease aircraft, fuel, and aluminium, had given the Red Air Force a quantitative advantage it would never relinquish. Through all of this, Pokrishkin flew his P-39. There is something almost stubborn in that fact, and it is worth pausing on it, because it tells us something about the nature of the relationship Soviet aces developed with the Airacobra that goes beyond tactical analysis. By 1944, the La-7 was available, a genuinely excellent Soviet fighter that many historians consider one of the best piston-engine aircraft produced by any nation during the war. Pokrishkin flew it occasionally, acknowledged its qualities, and returned to his P-39. In his explanation, given in various forms in post-war interviews and in his memoir, always returned to the same elements: the stability, the cannon, the dive, the radio. He had built his tactical identity around those qualities, and he was not prepared to discard the instrument that had produced 59 victories in favor of an aircraft that would require him to rebuild his doctrine from a different foundation. This is not the behavior of a man making do with inadequate equipment. It is the behavior of a craftsman who understands his tools. The practical consequences of the Soviet P-39 experience extended well beyond Pokrishkin and his regiment. The doctrine he had developed and taught in the Kuban spread through Soviet fighter aviation through a chain of instruction, an example that accelerated as the war progressed. Pilots who had trained under Pokrishkin's direct influence went on to command their own units and pass his principles forward. The formula of altitude, Speed, maneuver, and fire became the framework within which Soviet fighter training was restructured, a shift away from the rigid formation flying and defensive orientation of pre-war doctrine toward the energy management and aggressive initiative that characterized the best Western fighter thinking. That this doctrinal revolution was developed in and around an American aircraft by a Soviet pilot who had initially approached it with skepticism is one of the more quietly significant ironies of the lend-lease story. American planners who approved the transfer of P-39s to the Soviet Union had done so partly because the aircraft was available and partly because it was considered surplus to American and British requirements. The transfer was logistically convenient, as much as it was strategically calculated. No one in the offices where these decisions were made appears to have anticipated that the aircraft they were shipping across the Bering Strait and through the Persian Gulf will become the mount of the Soviet Union's most celebrated aviator and the instrument of its most consequential air combat doctrine. The total number of P-39s delivered to the Soviet Union under lend-lease was approximately 4,674 aircraft, the largest single allocation of any type to any lend-lease recipient. This figure requires a moment of consideration. The Soviet Union received more P-39 Airacobras than any other lend-lease aircraft type, more than the Douglas A-20 Havoc attack bomber, more than the Bell P-63 King Cobra that supplemented it in later deliveries, more than any of the British types transferred in smaller quantities. The volume of the transfer reflected both the American surplus of the type and Soviet willingness to accept and absorb it, a willingness that increased substantially as the operational results became evident. The production and logistical figures behind that number are worth considering in their own right because they illustrate the industrial scale of commitment. Each aircraft had to be manufactured in Buffalo, New York, flown to Gore Field in Montana or Ladd Field in Fairbanks, Alaska, handed over to Soviet ferry pilots, and flown eastward across the most forbidding geography in the Northern Hemisphere, over Siberian interior in temperatures that routinely fell below minus 40 degrees Celsius, to receiving depots thousands of miles from the front. Ferry pilots, both American and Soviet, died on that route. Aircraft were lost to weather, mechanical failure, and the simple attrition of operating complex machinery in extreme conditions over enormous distances. The aircraft that arrived at Soviet frontline units represented the surviving fraction of an effort that consumed enormous resources on both sides of the arrangement. The Soviet ferry pilots who flew the Alsab route left their own testimony about the aircraft, distinct from the combat pilots' accounts, but equally revealing. Their experience was of the P-39's handling characteristics across a much wider range of conditions and combat operations typically demanded, including extreme cold starts, high-altitude crews over mountain ranges, and extended over water legs where engine reliability was a matter of survival rather than tactics. Their general verdict was that the Allison engine, properly maintained and operated within its specified parameters, was reliable in conditions that would have challenged any power plant. The aircraft's handling at altitude and in cold air, they reported, was stable and predictable. It was not comfortable exactly, not in the way that a heated, pressurized cockpit would have been comfortable in those temperatures, but it was controllable, and controllability was what mattered when the alternative was the Siberian taiga. The post-war testimony of the surviving Soviet aces who flew the P-39 forms a body of evidence that is both rich and somewhat complicated by the political environment in which much of it was recorded. The Soviet Union's post-war attitude toward lend-lease was shaped by Cold War politics in ways that affected what veterans felt able to say publicly. Official Soviet historiography in the Stalin years tended to minimize the contribution of foreign equipment to Soviet victory, emphasizing instead the primacy of Soviet industrial effort and the heroism of Soviet personnel. Veterans who might have wanted to acknowledge the genuine contribution of American aircraft and supplies were operating in an environment where such acknowledgments were politically sensitive. Pokrishkin himself navigated this carefully. His memoir, published in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, acknowledges the P-39 with evident respect, but frames its qualities in terms of what Soviet pilots did with it rather than what the Americans provided. This was partly genuine, because the doctrine and the skill genuinely were Soviet achievements, and partly a reflection of constraints within which a Soviet military hero was expected to write. In private conversations recorded by colleagues and in interviews given after the Soviet Union's dissolution, When the political constraints had lifted, surviving veterans spoke more directly. Several described a moment of their initial conversion from skepticism to appreciation with a candor that the official record had not previously allowed. And the consistency of those accounts across different pilots and different units gives them a credibility that official accounts sometimes lack. Rechkalov, speaking in interviews conducted in the 1990s, described his early dismissal of the aircraft with evident embarrassment in retrospect. He said that he and his fellow pilots had been wrong, that they had judged the P-39 on its reputation rather than its reality, and that the reality had taken him by surprise in ways he had not anticipated. He spoke specifically of the cannon, of the first time he saw the result of a 37mm hit on a Heinkel He-111, and of the revision in his thinking that followed. The aircraft that Soviet pilots had called a reject had in his hands produced more aerial victories than anything else he flew. Dmitry Glinka, another P-39 ace who accumulated 50 confirmed victories during the war, most of them in the Airacobra, gave perhaps the most direct summary of the Soviet aces' collective experience in an interview recorded shortly before his death. He said that the pilots who had laughed at the aircraft in 1942 had stopped laughing by the summer of 1943. He said that the P-39 in skilled hands at the right altitude was not inferior to the Bf-109G. It was different, with different strengths and different weaknesses, and that the pilots who understood the difference and flew accordingly had done very well with it. Those who had tried to fly it the way they flew Soviet aircraft, ignoring its specific characteristics and demanding from it what was not designed to give, had struggled. This distinction between understanding an instrument and merely operating it runs through almost all the serious testimony about the Soviet P-39 experience, and it is not incidental. It is the heart of the story. The aircraft's limitations were real and should not be romanticized. Above 15,000 feet, the P-39's performance deteriorated markedly, a consequence of the Allison engine's lack of high-altitude supercharging that no amount of pilot skill could fully compensate. Soviet units flying Airacobras in operational environments that required sustained high-altitude work, particularly in the later stages of the war as the front moved into Poland and toward Germany, found the aircraft ceiling a genuine constraint. The transition to more capable Soviet types in those units was not reluctant. It was necessary. The P-39's contribution to Soviet victory was concentrated in a specific period and a specific operational context, and the honest assessment must acknowledge both what it achieved and where it fell short. The lend-lease program of which the P-39 was a part has been the subject of historical reassessment in the decades since the war's end, particularly as Soviet archives became more accessible following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The picture that has emerged is considerably more complex than either the Cold War Soviet narrative of self-sufficient victory or the Western narrative of decisive American material contribution. Soviet industry, relocated beyond the Urals in the desperate winter of 1941 and 42, genuinely did produce the majority of the weapons with which Soviet forces fought. Soviet workers, operating in conditions of extraordinary hardship, built the tanks and artillery pieces and aircraft that carried the Red Army from Stalingrad to Berlin. That achievement was real, and it was enormous. But the lend-lease contribution was also real, and it operated in domains where Soviet production was most strained. Aviation fuel and the high-octane additives required for high-performance engines. Aluminium, without which Soviet aircraft construction would have been severely constrained. Trucks and railway rolling stock, which underpinned the logistical system that fed the front. And aircraft, particularly fighters, that filled gaps in Soviet production during the most critical period of the war, the 18 months between the German invasion and the point at which Soviet industrial mobilization fully took hold. Nikita Khrushchev, speaking in a more candid atmosphere of de-Stalinization in the 1950s and early 60s, acknowledged privately that without lend-lease the Soviet Union would have found the war far more difficult to survive, let alone win. This was not a public admission, and it was not incorporated into official Soviet historiography, but reflected the judgment of a man who had been a senior political figure throughout the war and who understood what the material situation had actually been. The P-39, in this context, was not merely an aircraft. It was a component of an industrial and logistical system that helped bridge the gap between Soviet collapse and Soviet recovery. The fields where Soviet P-39s flew are quiet now. The airstrips carved out of steppe and forest in the Kuban and along the Don have in most cases returned to agriculture or been absorbed into the expanding geography of Russian cities. A handful of memorials mark the sites of former airfields, with plaques that list the units that flew from them and sometimes the names of pilots who did not come back. The language of the plaques is a language of Soviet military commemoration, focused on sacrifice and heroism, which is appropriate because those things were genuinely present. What the plaques do not always capture is the texture of the experience, the specific quality of what it meant to climb into an American aircraft in the winter of 1942, not want to be there, not trusting the machine, and to discover over the following months that the machine deserved better than the opinion you had formed of it. Pokryshkin received his third Hero of the Soviet Union decoration in August of 1944. The award ceremony photographs show a man in his early 30s who looks considerably older, in a way that combat aviation ages its practitioners not in wrinkles, but in the quality of stillness behind the eyes. He would survive the war. He would rise eventually to the rank of Marshal of Aviation, the highest rank in Soviet air forces. He would serve in administrative and command positions through the Cold War decades, overseeing the transition to jet aviation and the development of the Soviet air defense system. In all of his later years, through all those transitions, he continued to speak of the P-39 with a specific and undiminished respect that his colleagues noticed and sometimes found puzzling. His explanation, when pressed, was always the same. He had come to the aircraft with contempt, and it had given him results. That was not a small thing. In his experience, the lesson that an instrument deserves to be understood on its own terms rather than judged by its reputation was a lesson that cost some men their lives to learn and others their victories. He had been fortunate to learn it early, in conditions that allowed him to survive the learning, and he did not intend to pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidier national narrative. There is a particular kind of historical irony that becomes visible only in retrospect, when the distance of decades allows the full shape of events to come into focus. The P-39 Airacobra was designed in America, rejected by Britain, found inadequate by American units in the theaters where they most needed it, and shipped to the Soviet Union partly because there was nowhere better to send it. In Soviet hands, in Soviet conditions, flown according to a Soviet doctrine developed by a Soviet pilot who had initially wanted nothing to do with it, it became the instrument of some of the most effective fighter operations of the Second World War. It produced the leading ace of the Western Allied powers, if Soviet pilots are included in that accounting. It contributed to a doctrinal revolution that shaped Soviet air combat, thinking for years beyond the war's end. It arrived as a reject and departed as a legend. The mechanics who crowbarred open those first crates at Saratov in the autumn of 1942 and frowned at the car-type door and the mid-mounted engine had not been wrong to be puzzled. The aircraft was genuinely unusual. What they could not have known, what no one could have known without the evidence that would accumulate over the following 2 years, was that unusual was precisely what the situation required. The qualities that made the P-39 unsuitable for Battle of Britain made it, in a different light and at a different altitude, something close to ideal for the air war over the Kuban. The qualities that American pilots found limiting, the weight, the engine placement, the lack of high-altitude performance, were the same qualities that gave Pokryshkin his gun platform, his dive characteristics, his stability in the final seconds before the cannon fired. History does not often arrange itself so neatly. The Airacobra Soviet story is exceptional precisely because the fit between the aircraft's actual capabilities and the war's actual demands was so precise, and because the pilots who discovered that fit were acute enough to articulate what they had found and systematic enough to build something lasting from it. What Soviet aces said the first time they flew the American P-39 was, by and large, unflattering. What they said afterward, when the evidence had accumulated and the victories had been counted, was something considerably more complicated, more honest, and more interesting. They said that they had been wrong. And in the saying of it, they left behind one of the more instructive lessons the war produced, that an instrument judged by its reputation alone is an instrument not yet understood. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.